So welcome, good morning to everybody to our very first Rhetoric to Reality webinar series. It's a policy series trying to get beyond policy in terms of the usual solutions, the usual discussions, and just kind of get beyond to something a bit new, a bit more exciting, and a bit more engaging for our social enterprise members. So this, as I say, this is the first one of our series, and this one is called Achieving Policy Change in the Real World. So we've got four brilliant speakers today. We've got Sue Tibballs, Ewan Masson, Nick Cook, and Helen Denny from a variety of organisations who will give different perspectives on this topic. When we come to the discussion, we really want to hear from you as an attendee around any barriers, any kind of issues you face, particularly at a local level, but also national government level as well. But really thinking that in terms of the system, you know, what's not working in the system for you from your perspective. So not just saying you don't like that local official or that politician, but really just thinking that in terms of what needs to change. And I think that's a really important aspect of this webinar series, is really hearing from attendees about their own experiences and views. So we will dive straight in. So we'll get straight to the point in terms of the topic with our four speakers, and as I said, then go to the discussion. So our first speaker is Sue Tibballs, who is the former CEO of the Sheila McKechnie Foundation. Sorry, it's just clicked off my screen. Sue, I'll just hand over to you.
Thank you, and lovely to be here with you all. Thanks for asking me. As it says on the billing, I was chief executive of an organisation called the Sheila McKechnie Foundation for 9 years. I just left in January. So SMK is all about campaigning and social change, how to make change happen. So as such, policy making was just one dimension of our interest. I mean, we're primarily a capacity builder, so training and consultancy, but we did a lot on trying to build a better understanding of how change happens. And I guess the sort of simple observation that change happens typically when lots of different actors, people, organisations utilise different strategies. And clearly one of those is policy making, where you're working very directly with decision makers, but equally what will be in turn driving them will be public pressure. So everything that civil society does to raise the profile of issues in the public consciousness, to build pressure on politicians to move. So I guess contextually, it's maybe worth just sort of bearing that in mind, that as much as policy work is very focused on, obviously, parliamentarians and policy processes, parliamentarians are in turn pretty much focused on public opinion, and as we all know, in particular, their own position and security in their job. So we actually keep making the case that civil society does much more to create the political weather than is commonly recognised. So the work that charities and campaigners are doing to raise the profile of issues and shift, you know, the Overton window is often, I think, underdialed. And actually, I think even with the Westminster administration, there's been quite a few things that actually have either been pushed through or blocked, in large part because of civil society and people and community. So that's me. I left in Jan. I'm freelancing at the moment, but I'm also convening a group of charity chief execs in something called the Charity Reform Group. 14 CEOs who have come together to essentially try and prompt new thinking about charities and their future, and in a nutshell, trying to sort of move the understanding of charities away from the Victorian philanthropic mode, that we're just there to sort of pick up the pieces, and encourage the sector and help others understand that charities aren't there just to do that, they're also there to be agents of change and transformational change. And I'm going to talk in a minute about a report we published just before Christmas. But I also just wanted to say, because I'm very mindful that I'm based in London, I'm not working in Scotland, and I'm very conscious that the relationship between civil society and the Scottish Government is very different to the relationship that you would have and, you know, the regions have with the Westminster Government. We did at SMK run an initiative called Social Power Scotland for a couple of years, which was about bringing people from civil society in Scotland together to talk about common interests. And I remember that a really keen concern was that there's always a risk actually in Scotland that charity and civil society are too close to government and too co-opted, and there's not enough distance to really hold government to account, which at the time was in sort of stark contrast to our relationship with Westminster, which for the last, 15 years was a pretty hostile relationship, I would say, in terms of the coalition and then subsequent administrations' attitudes toward civil society. I know we're talking social enterprise, so apologies, I'm sort of using charities as a catch-all, but let's say the not-for-profit sector, civil society. And it remains, I think, a concern that, a lot of damage was done in terms of the relationship with Westminster. So I just wanted to flag, I can't speak to the detail in Scotland, but I know other speakers will. But in terms of Westminster government, I think a lot of damage was done in those 15 years where there was such strong hostility to particularly bigger civil society organisations having voice and influence. And that sort of had quite an insidious trickle-down effect, I think. And we've heard quite a lot about civil servants sort of coming up through the ranks and thinking it's not quite appropriate to talk to civil society organisations, don't bring them in and have them round the table, be a bit cautious. And all of that is deeply problematic. So I've only got a couple of minutes left. So let me just briefly say, with the Charity Reform Group, we published a report just before Christmas. I'll put it in the link. But it looks like this. It's called Forces for Good. And it's essentially making a case as to what civil society brings to government and indeed the private sector, the potential it holds to work together if it were allowed to work as equal partners. So it's sort of making a case that rather than seeing our sectors as being somewhere between sort of service providers, partners at best, and also irritants, it's trying to argue for a more grown-up partnership working together. So I hope that might be contextually of interest. But in terms of the discussion today, just to hone in on one area, we do talk quite a lot about policy making, because I guess a general observation from the group and also from SMK is that it can be quite difficult for social sector organisations to get the right balance in policy making, because you are on the one hand trying to advocate for a position and a cause. That's kind of our job, isn't it? Is to stick up for a constituency, stick up for those that we're working with. And yet policy making is a process of trade-offs. And I know that, and you probably know that, a lot of politicians, civil servants get very frustrated because they feel that our sector just comes and says, this isn't okay, you must stop, or do this. And actually often not very joined up, so they have lots and lots of different voices, or just advocating a fixed position, but not actually getting involved in policy development, where you get involved in what's possible, how can we actually, bring that to pass. And I think that something I would sort of put on the table for the rest of the discussion is, do others agree? And is that an area where there could be better support to help our sector not just advocate well and stand up for issues, but be more adept at getting into the conversations about policy development? And then, of course, and I know that a lot of the discussion is going to be policy implementation and making sure that it actually is implemented and what is intended comes to bear. So I'll stop, but hopefully those are helpful framing comments.
No, that's all great. And I think, as you mentioned, obviously the relationship with the Scottish government, with the UK government, is different for civic society. But I think there's a lot we can learn from that report. It's certainly something we can certainly apply in Scotland. And I think that relationship building is a really important point, actually. So great. Good start to our discussion so far. And Ewan from the Scottish Parliament Participation and Communities team, if you'd like to go next.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Thanks for having me along today. Yeah, as Duncan says, I'm Ewan Masson from the Scottish Parliament, from the Participation and Communities team, or PACT for short. It's a bit less of a mouthful. PACT exists to help support voices that may otherwise be missing from the work of Parliament to be heard. So that might be people who face barriers to participation, or who may be invited to share lived experience of some sort, or on issues that may be particularly traumatic. So our team comes in to kind of facilitate that and to work with those groups and individuals to help make sure they can be heard as part of the work of Parliament. And a lot of that work, most of that work actually, is done in partnership with the voluntary sector, with community groups, with social enterprises as well. And I could talk a little bit more about that as we go through. My own background is in the voluntary sector. So I started working in Parliament in 2017. For about 10 years prior to that, I worked in advocacy with adults with learning disabilities. So I think bringing that experience of advocacy, of helping, people to have their voices heard by others who are in a position of power, stood me in good stead, I think, coming into work in this team to help people share their views with the Scottish Parliament. And actually, the majority of our team, we are 9 full-time members of staff in our team, and the majority of them do come from that communities background, as opposed to coming in with a politics degree or any kind of academic background into that role. It's very much community development. So that's, in a nutshell, that my background in the work that we do in the team in Parliament. It's an interesting topic for me to be invited to kind of talk about, I suppose, from the point of view of a Parliament official, in that the Scottish Parliament doesn't actually implement policy. And a big part of my job when working with groups is to explain the role of Parliament and explain the difference between Parliament and government and the various different layers of politics in Scotland. So Parliament's role is to scrutinise the government and to hold it to account, quite possibly at times when there is a perception that it has failed to implement policy effectively, and that hasn't trickled down to communities. And so I guess the angle I would come at this question from, and Sue spoke about public pressure and the importance of public pressure in terms of policy development, is that public pressure and the views of communities and the views of individuals are just as important when it comes to scrutiny as it is to developing policy. So when things aren't working, is to have that political literacy and that awareness of where you can go to share that frustration, and to make sure that the people who are in the Parliament, your elected representatives, who are there to scrutinise the government and to ask them questions as to why things haven't worked out the way they maybe should have worked out, is that scrutiny is informed by public opinion, and it's informed by lived experience, and it is informed by the views of the people within local communities. And a lot of that is just about learning the various different avenues that you can go down to inform the Parliament, to inform MSCs. One is around understanding the committee system at the Scottish Parliament. We have 15 committees in the Parliament with various different policy areas that they're responsible for scrutinising government on. Committees are cross-party, they're made up of MSPs from across the political spectrum, and they will invite government ministers and cabinet secretaries in to answer questions on the record about their performance, about policy implementation, about various different aspects of the work of government. They can't be experts in every single area, and that's why it is vitally important that civic society and communities are able to communicate directly with those committees and with the members of those committees to make sure they understand what the issues are, so that questioning and that scrutiny can be well informed. It's about understanding the role of MSPs as well, and elected representatives at all levels, actually, your local councillors and MPs at Westminster. But my work is around working with MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. Even just the fundamental understanding that everyone in Scotland is represented by 8 MSPs as opposed to just 1. I think a lot of people think they need to go to their constituency MSP, and maybe we're talking just before the webinar started about in a situation where a politician or an elected official may be the barrier themselves. In Scotland, we have 8 MSPs that represent us. You have your constituency MSP and you have 7 regional MSPs. That gives you a bit of choice. It means that if someone is, you do perceive someone to be a barrier, you have 7 other people that you can approach. It may be that you have a preference for a particular individual that you have an existing relationship with in your organisation, or you may have a party political preference. So you have choice in your elected representatives as well to engage with them and to make sure that they're aware of the issues. It's understanding things like our petitions system and when that might be appropriate, things like cross-party groups and the role that cross-party groups might play in informing your elected representatives about the issues, so that they can then take that into their deliberations, into their debates, into their committee work. So these are all things that our team at Parliament can work with communities on to learn about and to build their capacity and understanding. I'm barely scratching the surface. I can spend a half day on this, so I'm happy to share my email address afterwards if anybody wants to follow up and talk about it in a little bit more detail. But that's the angle I would come at here in terms of that, the scrutiny role. When it isn't going right, what can you do, and what are your choices then to kind of get answers from the government and hold them to account? In terms of how we do that and how we, again, I don't have time to go into this, we do kind of, as a team, work towards the principles of community development when we're working with communities to involve them in the work of Parliament. We don't like this idea of just parachuting in, running a focus group and then leaving. We do try and develop relationships with the sector. We try and work in advance with the groups who are going to be engaging with the Parliament to make sure they have an element of control over how that is done as well as what is discussed. We are rolling out a process of deliberative democracy just now, which are things like citizens panels and people's panels that people may become more aware of in future years as we do more of this stuff. So that is essentially working with a randomly selected section of the Scottish population over a longer period of time to help them learn about a topic and deliberate and then make recommendations to a Parliament committee. So a couple of the more recent panels that have looked actually at areas loosely related to the implementation gap around Scottish drugs policy and around climate change. So again, no time to go into that, but links to reports are available on the Parliament website as well. The final thing I'll kind of just leave you with, and Sue touched on this as well, around certain trade-offs, is just being mindful of the impact that you're aiming for when you engage in processes like this. I, for the best will in the world, would love to come with a really neat example of where a group has lobbied for a particular change to a Parliament committee. The committee has then recommended it to government, and the government has then done it. But impact doesn't tend to be as linear as that. It might be that you engage in a process and you find that it informs the thinking of MSPs as they take that into future debates. You might find that it actually reinforces what is already happening or what is already planned, and that in itself is impact, even though it doesn't result in a change. It might be something that I've heard described in Westminster circles as the delayed drop effect, whereby a Parliament committee will recommend something to government based on what it's heard from communities. The government will say, no, that's nonsense, we're not doing that. And then 2 or 3 years later, it happens. But it's hard to trace that back to the initial intervention and the initial engagement because so much time has passed and who's been keeping an eye on that. So just being mindful of, expectation management around impact as well. But anyway, whistle-stop tour of a number of different things there. Hopefully that's food for thought as we go into our discussions.
That's great, thanks, Ewan. And I'd say that, I will always big up the PACT team at the Scottish Parliament. I think they're really good in terms of reaching out to communities, especially in comparison to other parliaments across the UK and the world, actually. Great. So we'll come to questions at the end after all our speakers have been, but I will now pass on to our third speaker, who is Nick Cook from the Association for Scottish Public Affairs, ASPA, and also works for the People's Postcode Lottery.
Hi, folks. I do have some slides, but I'm not going to speak sort of slavishly to them. Sort of temper my sort of remarks, and I think we've had some insightful contributions just to start things off. As Duncan has said, I'm really here stemming from my role with ASPA, which is does what it says on the tin, Association of Scottish Public Affairs. Representative body. So if any of you folks think you should be members but are not, please give us a Google, and for a modest fee you can get all our sort of member benefits, come to our conference, and sharing all the benefits that you sort of garner from being in the room with like-minded individuals, and sessions like today of course also help that. In my day job, I work for People's Postcode Lottery as their head of UK Public Affairs. So most of the sort of takeaways I'm going to give today are in the reserved context, because we actually are governed by the Gambling Act, which is reserved to Westminster. But obviously I've experience working at Holyrood and also had over a decade in Scottish local government as well. So pretty varied across the different levels of representation across the UK. Just going to start a little bit with PPL. We obviously exist to fund charities. We don't exist for commercial gain, and all sorts of weird and wonderful figures in front of you there in terms of number of players, and the key there obviously we've raised 1.5 billion for charities all across GB. We don't operate in Northern Ireland because of outdated gambling laws, which as you might expect I'm going to come to, but fantastic social change we have the pleasure of supporting day in, day out, very much threaded into what we do. And uniquely, charity lottery funding is different from the national lottery because it's long-term and unrestricted. If any sort of good causes or social enterprise or bona fide charities hear the term unrestricted funding, it's relatively unique, and that's intrinsic to our model. You can see just here the sort of breadth of big charities that we fund, which will give context to what I'm going to go on and talk about in terms of achieving policy change and working with partners and working with stakeholders. So because of the gambling laws and our public affairs work, which again I'll come to, we operate these 20 charitable trusts which fund charities by theme or by geography, but you can see many of the country's best known charities, a lot of Scottish-based charities, but also countries operate in different parts of the country, whether that be Scotland only, Wales only, GB-wide or full UK-wide. Really diverse range of folks doing fantastic work, and you can see there a little bit about the type of funding that they receive from our players on an ongoing basis, which is, yeah, particularly thinking back to COVID when I joined the organisation, in terms of the core funding offer was literally used to maintain premises and minimise furlough of staff. Very much relationship based on respect for the charity sector, which, as we've said, heard from previous speakers, is not something that's always fully demonstrated from decision makers, certainly at Westminster, but also sometimes in other contexts as well. And always something that I'm cognizant of, coming from working for a politician, working for a political party. It's very interesting to see fundamentally at government level, ministerial level, there can often be very little difference in terms of the value or lack of value that's often ascribed to the charity sector and the social value and social impact that it generates. I think it's quite striking. The same characteristics are often on display across parties. Then also just a little bit about the local grant funding that we offer. So this is for grassroots, community groups, charities, CICs, social enterprises can apply there for multi-year local funding, which is a real game changer and something we've just switched to in response to charitable need. As you might expect, we can map all this by postcode. So in terms of political engagement, NEMP, MSP, member of Parliament in Wales, local councillors, regional MSPs, we can really drill down to the sector the sectors that we fund and the charities that we fund in their particular patch, which is a fantastic resource to have. So our policy change has all been centred on the restrictions in the Gambling Act. So believe it or not, despite the fact that we operate not-for-profit charity lotteries, with only type of gambling or fundraising products is subject to annual caps on sales. So in 2020, we had a pretty big success in convincing the then Conservative government to increase that limit fivefold, from 10 million per year to 50 million. And that's just going back to these different trusts. That's why we have to have this duplicatory structure, because each one of those runs an individual lottery, which could only sell tickets up to 50 million per year. Previously, that was 10 million. Continue very much to try to have this changed. And that's not for commercial benefit or in terms of the number of tickets we can sell, but it's very much a restriction on how we fund good causes, because you can't move the funding around between the trusts, so it's duplicatory, and it means all the funding that our players raise is stuck in a silo, so we can't reallocate funding based on charitable need, which is absolutely crazy, because all this funding is generated, as you'd expect, by players at no cost to government. So we're trying, and indeed not doing very well with the current government, who just last week delivered us some pretty negative news that they don't plan to make further changes to this. So we've got a meeting with the UK gambling minister tomorrow in London, so don't want to jinx anything, but at a really difficult juncture in terms of achieving further reform. But I want to just now touch a little bit on the lessons that we learned from the 2020 reforms. And actually, I think going back to what we really want to be talking about in terms of the policy implementation gap, in terms of when does good policy not continue to be supported, or when does it not really trickle down, and when is the impact not measured, and when does government make the wrong decisions? I just wanted to first point to a couple of pointers that we found were pretty central to our campaign. There's strength in numbers. Always seek partnerships, always use umbrella bodies to help make your case. If you're one organisation lobbying for something, you're probably not going to get very far, so always make sure that you're working with other like-minded individuals who seek the same change. The power of the narrative is very important. As you might expect, we put the charity voice front and centre in the change we are trying to make. We're a lottery operator, which, you know, we do very important work, but actually trying to spotlight the individuals who actually deliver the services on the ground or benefit from them, we found was of critical importance. Champion politicians are really important. We're saying just before the call, actually, it's often not politicians that are the blocker. And as Sue said, politicians make decisions for different reasons from civil servants, but keep an open mind and engage very broadly. We had Kirsty McNeill, who's now obviously the Scotland Office Minister, speak at an event that we did recently for our supported charities. And it really struck me when she says, don't presume to know a politician's values or motivations. Just because you think a politician may be interested in a certain area or because a politician represents a certain party, don't prejudge what's important to them or how they might approach an issue. So obviously you want to establish your champions, but when you're doing that, engage broadly and keep an open mind about what politician may end up championing your cause. You know, really striking insight that that Kirsty shared, and it's really stuck with me. Campaign strategy is really important. Sometimes you know, you don't have a media ready line to take that's going to sort of capture the public imagination. So know when you need to campaign quietly and know when it's time to get loud and try to make some noise. We don't get the opportunity to do that very many times and be heard, and it loses effect. So be very careful about that. So you also touched on this, and that's the fact that evidence is very important, and it can be time consuming. It can sometimes be costly. Sometimes we don't have budget to do that, but certainly if there is budget to do that, to invest in evidence, whether it's polling, whether it's reports, certainly worth doing, but also know when the time is to use the detailed evidence, and it tends to be with those detailed discussions with the civil service. Politicians are short on time. Many of them have notoriously short attention spans, I think it's fair to say. They need the top line and they need the bite-sized messaging. You need that, but that does not mean that you should not do the detailed work that sits behind a policy. Pre-packed solutions, detailed solutions, in our experience, are hugely welcomed by the civil service, who themselves are short on resource, and sometimes, admittedly, sometimes not, by their own admission, short on knowledge and expertise in the vast areas that a lot of their directorates are responsible for. So very much, you know, if you have the opportunity to hire or use a policy log, make you know, excellent use of them. It's all about having that information for the right audience. This just a little of a visual representation of what I've just been saying. So you can see a couple of newspaper headlines there. They all focus on the charities and the change the charities want, not what we want as a lottery operator. And when I was talking there about not prejudging people's motivations or interests, there's a picture there. Many of you will remember Jacob Rees-Mogg, who actually became quite an advocate in the last Parliament for, much to our surprise, by all admissions, became an advocate for charity lotteries and additional charity funding from the charity lottery sector. His motivations were slightly different. They weren't about necessarily giving support for charities per se, but he had a particular issue with the National Lottery's state monopoly and the fact that if players want to generate funding for good causes, no cost to government, they should be free to do so. But that was an unlikely partnership, which we very much had to enter into with an open mind. But it just shows, going back to what Kirsty McNeill said, that it's very important to engage broadly and not sort of make uninformed judgments on people's motivations or values. Conscious I'm speaking on a little bit. One of the big things that I think is wrong, particularly with UK decision making, is the limited scope of policy reviews. They're piecemeal, they're inadequate. They focus far too much on quantitative data, and they don't take a holistic approach to measuring the social value of what we all provide in different ways, what social enterprises provide as well. Lack of clarity in terms of how policy will be reviewed, what are realistic next steps, what should stakeholders expect. It's hard to have a cookie cutter process, but I think across all policy areas, government could be clearer in terms of how they're going to review the impact of a policy. Just to finish up, a couple of other reasons, and this is really going on to my local government experience. In my direct experience, that was very much involved in transport and the built environment in Edinburgh, on the City of Edinburgh Council. And we spent a lot of time debating very, very important and sometimes very positive policy changes without there being a financial commitment or the ability to financially enact the policy. And there's a huge gap there between intentions and deliverability. And that still happens, particularly in local government, but also in the devolved assemblies and in the UK Parliament as well. It's a huge problem. And again, lastly, this reform and move on mindset. And it goes back to the civil service and the lack of capacity, lack of time. They'll do something, they'll tick it off the list, and they're reluctant to go back and actually look at the need for continued reform, or how a change that's been made can be tweaked appropriately after that holistic engagement with stakeholders to ensure that actually it's not time wasted. They make a quick fix, forget about it. That's a real problem in terms of policy making.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. And I think that's a really interesting and important perspective as well. That's kind of our perspective as well as an organization trying to campaign on behalf of social enterprises, some of the barriers that we, our types of organizations face as well. So we understand what it's like at a grassroots level, but also we're facing similar challenges ourselves, trying to get your voices heard in those policy processes. I think it's really, really important to emphasize that. I think often it's about understanding perspectives of other people. So, we know lots of civil servants, they're doing a great job, but they're obviously facing barriers themselves in terms of policy implementations. There's lots of, it can be quite complicated, but I think it's just understanding other people's perspectives, I think sometimes. And I think that point about unexpected alliances is a really interesting one as well. So absolutely. So we speak to politicians from across political parties, and we find support in very unexpected places sometimes, and sometimes places where we expect support, it's not there. So it's quite a challenging, interesting sector to work in that regard as well. So brilliant. So we'll now move on to our final speaker. It's Helen Denny from the Melting Pot, who's one of our brilliant social enterprise members. So I will hand over to you, Helen.
Great, thank you. I'll just get my slides up, hopefully you can see them. So yeah, thanks, it's really interesting just hearing all the different perspectives there. I will give you a bit of an overview of the Melting Pot, who we are, what we do, and then I'll probably talk less about policy change, but more, I suppose, what we just do from a bottom-up kind of grassroots level to try and enact change within our sort of sphere of influence. So the Melting Pot is Scotland's Centre for Social Innovation. I've been the chief exec in post for coming up to 3.5 years, and we have been around in the social enterprise space for 18 years, so quite a long time. And over that time, we've kind of scaled and grown in terms of what we do. Just in terms of social innovation as a definition there, I think often it's a bit confusing about what it is, what do we mean by social innovation. We really talk about it as that kind of creative process of addressing some of those really complex challenges and problems that are around in society, whether that's climate change, homelessness, right through to tackling some of those big wicked problems that have continued to exist for a very long time. And we act as an enabler to try and support our members and our wider network to address and try and come up with innovative ways of solving those problems. How do we do that? So we do that from really every stage of kind of an innovator's journey, right from people who have got the seed of a good idea. We take them and help them think through that idea, think around what is the change they could make within their communities, wherever they're based in Scotland, and then support them to develop that into a social business or a campaign. Or some decide to go, this is too hard being an entrepreneur, and might just go and work within that area instead, which is, you know, all part of that process. The other part of what we have is a really busy collaborative hub. It's in the centre of Edinburgh, and it's full of social innovators. So on the last count, over 90% of our members would be classed as social innovators. And they're all doing something to enact kind of positive impact on people and planet, from micro enterprises to individuals to purpose-driven businesses. We're cross-sector, so, you know, we've got social enterprises, but we've also got B Corps and charities in there as well. So it's a real mix of people who come in and work in our space. And again, we try and facilitate collaborations and connections so that we're getting people to work with people out with their usual networks, because I think that's often where you can influence change, is stepping out of those silos. And then the final kind of stream or income stream for the business is through our consultancy, where as people develop and grow their enterprises, we work with them at a later stage as they're scaling to help them solve some of those people, place and productivity problems. And any profits we make are reinvested back in to support the people right at the beginning of their journey. We've also recently launched something called the Connected Hubs Network, and I'm just going to touch on that because I think it links into this kind of policy into practice conversation. And that is a network of other independent spaces and hubs like us across Scotland. And we've working with 3 other partners, we've launched that hub to try and create a bit of a platform to advocate for the work these hubs are doing in their local communities. They're often tiny independent spaces, many of them in rural communities that are often overlooked, but are actually quite significant in terms of the economy, the economic development piece within those communities. They're offering places and spaces for people to work, which is really critical for certain demographics of people within those communities. And they're contributing to, you know, a number of the kind of sustainable development goals. They're feeding into that kind of community wealth building agenda as well. So by creating this platform, this network, we're hoping over time to amplify the work they're doing and encourage people to start using these spaces within their communities. That's just an example on that slide of kind of where we're at in terms of numbers. So we have a core kind of membership here in Edinburgh of over 450 members. That's varying degrees of how people interact with us. And then we have a Scotland-wide network of over 4,000 now. And the kind of example there is all the different people we work with. We try and work across sectors, so private sector, public, academic, third sector. And I think for us, that kind of feeds into, I suppose, if we're talking about policy, where I often think we don't really influence policy, we just get on with it and make the change happen around us, and we try and do the best we can and advocate for our network and our members and that wider Scotland piece. We, at the heart of everything we do, we talk around people affected by the problem are best placed to solve it. And actually for us, I suppose, that has led to a lot of the decisions we've made in the last few years in terms of our strategy and approach. Because it feeds into social innovation. It needs to be collaborative, it needs to be cross-sector, it needs to be open source. You need time to experiment, it's iterative, it's about community, it's about co-creation. So it's really about stopping and listening to the people who are affected by the problems, whatever those problems are, and then working alongside them, as opposed to, I think, a lot of our systems that we're trying to enact change in, where there's often this kind of sticky plaster that comes in and we've solved homelessness by doing X, Y, and Z. Oh no, we haven't. And 30 years on, that we still have a huge issue in lots of areas. So one of the things that we talk around in the work we do with our community is system change. Anyone who's on this call and tries to work in that space will know it's complex and difficult. But I think for us, we see our place as trying to just do micro projects and small changes that will enact that system change over time. Because actually, from our point of view, the way policy, where a lot of the systems work, they I can't use that word because it's lunchtime and I need lunch. Exacerbate is the word I'm trying to say. Some of the problems that we see, some of these wicked and complex problems. So actually, we think you need new and innovative ways of solving the challenges. So I think that's really key to our work, and we've got various initiatives in that space to try and break down some of those silos, to embed our community and the people we work with at the heart of everything we do. And I think when you talk then around policy into practice, I never really see what we do sitting in that policy space, but over 30 years of working in this sector, I realised that I've recently got involved with the policy group, because actually I think you do have to understand the different policies and where you maybe have a tiny bit of influence. And we're starting to touch on some of the current policies we kind of play into, some of the things like community wealth building. We want to kind of feed into that, especially with the Connected Hubs network and the work of all of our members here and the change they're making on the ground. There's bits and pieces that feed into the kind of wider economic transformation piece. There's a lot of talk around entrepreneurship, growth, inclusive economies. Actually, what we're seeing for a lot of the people we support is that actually they're still really overlooked, because they're not going to scale and become global businesses or potentially unicorns. But what they are doing is creating jobs and opportunities on the ground in those, you know, smaller communities. So we're trying to advocate through the different networks we're part of and the work we're doing for some of those micro enterprises that are scaling deep and at a local level, but are making a huge impact and actually creating opportunities for people who are often excluded from the workforce, or etc. So I think there's quite a lot in there that we touch on through our work. I could probably keep going, but I'm really conscious I've probably run over time. So I will stop there and then can share a couple of links and other bits and pieces in the chat.
Great, thanks, Helen. I think it's a really important perspective as well. Obviously, the social enterprise perspective is, you know, our perspective, and I think it's really important to say that, yeah, it's important to get involved in policy processes with politicians, officials, but obviously policy change and social change happens in our communities as well, in different ways, in a grassroots way as well. So there's different ways to get policy change, to get social change. I think that's really, really important to emphasize that. So thank you. Brilliant. So we've got a bit of time now for questions and discussion. So I would encourage anybody who's an attendee to unmute. Well, sorry, put your hand up. Sorry, I should say that first. Put your hand up. Come on camera if you want to, and unmute, obviously. Alternatively, you can post questions in the chat if you'd like as well. If you don't want to come on camera, we can do this anonymously as well if you want to. So anybody like to go first? And there's a lot to digest and a lot of information there. But we're really keen on hearing your perspectives in terms of, you know, particularly at a local level, the barriers, challenges you're facing at a local level, as I mentioned before. But also what can change in terms of those systems, you know, what would help you? What would be better for you? What would help you engage better with policy? And that includes Scottish government level as well as local government level. Great. I rambled a bit there, so give people time to think and put their hands up. Jill Keegan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, hi. I was really interested in what Sue was saying earlier about, and agreed that the community sector in Scotland, or the broader third sector in Scotland, sits a bit too close to national government in terms of our reliance on funding. And I just wondered about, just like to hear more thoughts from Sue about that in terms of how we as a sector can row away and stay sustainable. Yeah, I just, because I agree, but I'd just like to hear a wee bit more on what you think about that, Sue, basically. Thank you.
Shall I come back now?
Yeah, if you'd like to, yeah, go for it, yeah.
So it's really hard, isn't it? Because of course, so many organisations are reliant on public money. And actually, you know, you want to maintain good relationships. You very often, albeit from different positions, trying to pursue shared goals. And a lot of the conversation's been about understanding the constraints that policymakers are working within. But, you know, you kind of need each other. I think some of it is about the sector working out how it can join up, because of course there is force in numbers, and that point I was making about what I think policymakers can sometimes experience as a kind of cacophony of voices rather than a symphony where organisations come together. You know, it's obvious, I suppose, but if people working on similar issues, or indeed across if they're not working on similar issues but can come together to lobby, that's obviously very, very powerful, and I'm sure that happens quite well. But the other thing that's went through my mind actually is that I know a charity in the West Midlands who are entirely dependent on local authority money, and it was at risk of being taken away from them. They're called Grapevine. They quite often get talked about because they're interesting. They do a lot of direct support to vulnerable adults, so they're a traditional service providing charity. They employ a lot of community organising techniques, but I know that they publicly protested their money being taken away, which is the sort of thing that I think small charities are always told not to do. Do not call out your paymaster. They did it and they were successful. So I say that with some caution, but I do wonder whether we tend to be a bit too cautious and supplicant at times, and the local authorities will be worried about their reputation. I mean, you obviously need to exhaust all avenues, talking directly. You definitely don't want to get the placards out unless you've been, you know, you've done all you can to try and talk directly to the local authority. But I do think we sometimes are too timid. But I'd be interested in other people's thoughts on that.
Any of our other speakers want to come back on that particular question?
Yeah, I'll pop in. I mean, I think fundamentally, it's very difficult because I think particularly in Scotland, but also elsewhere, there is quite a reliance on public funding for the third sector. I think that really changes the dynamic. But that's where you need diversity of funding, and I know that's a really easy thing to say, but a difficult thing to achieve. But I think Sue's right that sometimes the sector is a little bit too timid in terms of where the incorrect decision is being made in relation to your funding. You shouldn't be afraid to be robust, and sometimes that's the only course of action to take. It's very difficult for you to sort of counteract something that's just been handed down to you in terms of a negative decision behind closed doors. But that grassroots support, and again, that sort of coalition building is very important.
Great. Helen or Ewan, have you got anything to add to that?
I mean, I just say from a scrutiny perspective, it's possible to not view it as taking positions on one side versus the other. I mean, quite often when government policies being, the voluntary sector or third sector are being involved in scrutinising government policy, it can be about the impact that it's having on people and on communities, which is what the sector is there to advocate for, without necessarily getting into issues around funding. Inevitably, that does come up because it has an impact. But and I've seen situations where committees have been scrutinising government policy, and it isn't necessarily one side versus the other, and the government can actually quite welcome a report and recommendations from a committee that has been rooted in views and experiences from the sector and from various communities, because it allows everybody to kind of work together towards better policy. So it isn't always about being combative when you are critical or when you share opinions on things, as one perspective that I would add.
Helen, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think it's probably what everyone's already said. I think it's quite an interesting point. I think there was an example here in Edinburgh where there was going to be some funding cut fairly recently. A few people know about that. And actually it was organised, a bit of technology helped through Community Lab and people, and they protested, and that decision was reversed for a short period of time. So I think that standing up and advocating for change does work. But I think it's indicative of a bigger problem in terms of how do you create, more robust organisations that are not reliant on just one angle of money as well, or at the whim of politicians and their cuts as well. So it's complex.
Yep, very fair points. So I'm aware there's a question in the chat, but I'll come to the two hands up first on the screen. So Lucy, if you'd like to come in next.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks so much to speakers for really interesting presentations, and thanks to Social Enterprise Scotland for organising. My name's Lucy Mulvey, and I'm Head of Policy at the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland, which is the national third sector intermediary for health and social care. I guess I just had a couple of points, observations, but also possibly questions, one around evidence and the other about the kind of timescales issue as well. I think definitely one of the things that we're aware of is what important a role evidence can play in terms of demonstrating whether policy has actually been implemented or not, and if it has been implemented, what the impact has been, and whether that's the intended impact or not. But it's the type of evidence that is often the sticking point for this, and increasingly, having spent a long time building up the importance of particularly qualitative evidence from communities and people with lived and living experience, and the importance of that, and how important a role that does play in actually informing and influence the creation of policy in the first place, it becomes deprioritized at points in the process in favour of large-scale quantitative studies, etc., etc. So the old thing about stats versus qualitative evidence. And so I think we are finding as well increasingly now in this time of public finance crisis that just seems to be going on forever, that particularly in the health and care sector, that decision makers are potentially placing more importance on and evidence other than the routine evidence that third sector organisations are gathering that clearly demonstrate the positive impact of the work they're doing, particularly in prevention and early intervention, as a way of further narrowing, moving the goalposts in terms of what's going to get funded in future or not, as the case may be. And I think that's a particularly worrying situation and causing great concern amongst many of our members. So that's the first thing on evidence. And then another sort of point or question I had maybe was also about the timescales. And I think it is really important that we increase decision makers' awareness and understanding of the length of time that change can sometimes take, particularly if you're reporting to public sector funders, and we are very, very grateful for the funding on a quarterly or annual basis. Very often the work we're doing will not bear fruit during that period, never mind within an even longer period. And an example I often give is work being done to reform mental health and incapacity legislation to make it more rights-based and compliant with international human rights law. I first started working on this in 2015 and it's still not achieved exactly what we want it to, but there have been incremental gains along the way. That's 10 years worth of work. So I'm still reporting every so often to Scottish Government, say, still working on this, still working on this. A little change might have happened, but not the big change that we've said, but just to let you know, we are still working on it. And at the moment, that seems to be okay, but there's definitely a mixed levels, I think, of understanding and awareness amongst some civil servants about really how quickly some of this change that even they want to see happen can actually happen. So any views on either of those things, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think they're both very good points, actually. I mean, in terms of the length policy actions and implementation take is quite incredible. I think sometimes you're like, when we're talking about this 20 years ago, could be the Christie Commission report from 15 years ago, whatever kind of thing. Just briefly in terms of evidence, I think we're quite good at offering case studies as evidence, which are brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because we've got loads of them, but I think we need to do better in terms of quantitative evidence, actually. I think that's just a gap we've got from our perspective. Any of our speakers want to come in on either of those points?
I'll come in just quickly on. I think I agree with almost everything you said, Lucy. I think it's almost incumbent upon us to continue to push a suitable mix of qualitative and quantitative evidence. And what I say in my experience is that it goes back to what we were saying at the outset, that it sometimes very much depends on the individuals that you're dealing with, what they place the value on. So we went through a period a number of years ago where civil servants were telling us there wasn't enough information on the charity lottery sector. So we actively started creating funding, commissioning evidence, and that's to an extent welcomed at that point. But we're now in a position where it's being questioned because, oh, it's commissioned by you and you're not an impartial actor in this. And that is because of a changing of individuals within the civil service who view the evidence very differently. So I think, you continue to have to provide both types of evidence, and it's incumbent upon us to stress why that is important. And facts and figures and data, perhaps a bedrock of a decision, but they're not the be all and the end all. And case studies in the round are still very important and very impactful.
So we've almost run out of time. I'm happy to run over by a few minutes if that's okay with our speakers, just like 5 or 10 minutes or something like that, if that's okay. Because I'm aware the conversation seems like it's just kind of going, just kind of starting in a way. So any of our other speakers want to come back on either of those points at all about evidence or the long-term impact, long-term policy, the word policy implementation?
The only thing I would jump, I think Lucy made those points very well. The only thing I would jump in on is, our team exists in the Parliament to make sure that lived experience is priority, or is given, a very, very important role alongside quantitative evidence in terms of policy scrutiny, and that, that a lot of work goes on behind the scenes at the Parliament within other teams. We're working alongside our researchers who will provide briefings for committee members when they're taking evidence, and those briefings have changed over the years and now have, much more lived experience work being brought into that from the scrutiny side of it. So, hopefully that then feeds into policy development, but it's probably easier from a scrutiny perspective to reflect on the impact that policy has had on people and to bring that kind of qualitative stuff into the scrutiny side of it than it is around policy development, which isn't necessarily my area of expertise. So probably shouldn't say too much on that.
That's okay. Any of our other speakers want to come back on any of those points at all? No. Sorry, Zim Scott, would you like to go next? Sorry, it's taken a while to get to you there.
Thank you so much for creating this vital dialogue and for giving me the opportunity to contribute. I'm from Zim Scott. My name is Lydia Heather Mudari. Sorry, I'm using my work.
Okay.
That's why I'm saying Zim Scott, but actually I'm known as Heather. And I represent Zim Scott, an organization that is bridging Zimbabwe and Scotland through culture, climate exchange, and empowering communities with support and easy access to essential services they need as diaspora communities and immigrants in Scotland. As a Black woman living in Scotland, I know firsthand the power of representation, and more importantly, the cost of its absence. In my work, I advocate for marginalized communities, particularly women of color and migrant communities, who are often excluded from decision-making spaces, even if they are the most impacted by inequality and poor policy implementation, whether it's about climate governance, local services, or parliamentary representation. We often see a repeated pattern. So my question today is, what intentional efforts are being made to support and prepare marginalized voices for leadership roles in the Parliament or beyond on decision-making tables? And how do we move from surface level consultation to deep transformative power sharing in Scottish policymaking? Those are just a few of my questions. Otherwise, I'll be speaking for the whole day.
No, it's all good. I'm really glad you raised that perspective as well, because I think like that's one of our key tasks is basically those excluded people in society, how they get their voices heard. And I think it's a real challenge actually. I don't know if you might want to come in about that first, if it's about.
It sounds like that's probably one
Yeah.
for yeah, my answer could be extremely lengthy on this as well, so I will just start by saying feel free to reach out and we could have a chat further about this, because it is an interesting topic. We ran a communities conference just a couple of weeks ago on the back of a series of community outreach events over the last year, and one of our workshops was discussing this very thing, was about increasing diversity in the work of Parliament, and a lot of it comes down to the work of our team around this community development approach that we take to working with communities. We do look to work in partnership with organisations, with advocacy organisations, representative organisations who have the trust of their community already, to spend time within communities to develop that trust, rather than, as you say, parachute in and do a quick consultation and then leave. So there is work ongoing to develop the way that us as a team work within communities to build that confidence capacity for people to take part and to share that space. The deliberative, the people's panels work that I spoke about, that I don't have time to explain in any great detail, but these involve working with a randomly selected section of the Scottish population, usually about 25 people, and they are broadly representative of the Scottish population in terms of age, geography, ethnicity, socioeconomic background, etc. So, and that's another tool that we can use to ensure broad representation in the work of Parliament going forward. So I think there is a lot of what came through our discussion in that workshop at that conference, though, was about trust in politics and about people will be more willing to engage in politics if they see themselves represented in their elected representatives. And as a member of staff at Parliament, there isn't a lot I can do about that. That is down to the political parties and who they field for election, and then who people vote for in terms of representation within the 129 MSPs in the chamber. But where I can come in and where our team can come in is to make sure that we are working in partnership with communities and developing that trust and that ongoing relationship to try and ensure that the voices that we bring in to inform that scrutiny are as diverse as possible. But real whistle stop tour there, I'm happy to pick that up with you separately if you would like a further chat.
So any of our speakers or anybody else here actually got any views on policy exclusion? I think that's a really, really important point.
I mean, I don't particularly have a view other than I agree with what you've said, Heather. Like, I think it's really apparent in where voices of minority groups have been excluded. And I think from a practical level, what we've tried to do is just be really conscious of that in the work that we do and think around how can we represent the voices through our events, through our incubator, through our consultancy, and partner with people who are trying to make that change happen. And there is some brilliant social enterprises that I know of who are trying to advocate for different voices in Scotland. I'm sure you'll know Bailey from Decamai, as well as others like Eloa from Adelphi Hub. And I think it's actually, how do we get more of their voices heard in even webinars like this and beyond, which I know Duncan and the team also think about when they put these together. So I think it's just really important that, yeah, we recognise that a lot of policy is still not considering all groups.
Yeah, we're very conscious. Decamai did actually produce a report as well, which is definitely worth digging out and having a look at that. I'd recommend a reading for everybody, I think. Anybody else want to pick up on that particular point? No. Okay, so we'll just move on quickly to the chat. So there is a question from Graham. Sorry, again, it's taken a long time to get to your question. And it comes back to that point about lived experience, but he said, are there any good examples of best practice where amplifying the voice of those with lived experience in terms of policy is good? Any particularly good examples anybody's got? Any good case studies?
I put a link in the chat to work that the Sheila McKechnie Foundation has done a lot of work, not just on bringing voices into policy making, but actually how you have solidarity across social change efforts right across the spectrum. And there's loads there actually on the website that might be of use and interest to people. But a lot of the really obvious things in terms of policy making is the sort of just wheeling people out who have lived experience and putting them in front of MPs in a rather sort of tokenistic way. There's quite rightly a refusal or discomfort with doing that. So how do you actually, I mean, it's much more, Helen, what you were speaking to really about working with and alongside. But actually the other thing I would say is that an awful lot of social change is driven by people with lived experience, because sadly many campaigners are thrust into campaigning because something has happened. The very best campaigners aren't campaigning from lived experience. And so there's also, I guess, Heather, that opportunity is, as well as asking to be let in on the inside, is just raising your voice on the outside and bringing your own experience to bear. But representation really, really matters. So yeah, you need both.
It's about creating the right spaces and places for people, as you kind of said. It's like, going into Parliament, for example, is really intimidating. It's stressful for us sometimes, because of the environment and the people we're speaking to. It's, it is intimidating actually. So I think it's being in the right places and spaces for people to be able to give that lived experience, I think is really important.
I think it always helps to bear in mind, can I just say, I think it
Yeah.
helps to bear in mind that politicians aren't always that smart. I always was slightly intimidated when I was very young because I just assumed that I was going to be relatively ignorant. And it doesn't take long to work out that that may well not be the case. And I think that's a very helpful thing to know. So don't be intimidated.
That's a really good point, to be honest. I mean, we kind of see them as a blank sheet of paper in a way, in terms of our topic. It's like, well, we're the experts in this area. You're the experts in your area, kind of thing. They won't know what you're talking about until you tell them. So I think that's a really good point, actually. Yeah. So just see them as knowing nothing, and we're there to feed them really good information. Anybody else want to pick up on any of those points? Any of those additional points, or any additional questions? Any final questions at this point? So I know the debate could go on for hours. I'm aware of that. We're all very immersed in this topic, I think. So Andy's put up a poll about just a very short poll. If you've seen that link, hopefully you can fill that in just to say how you found the webinar today. That'd be really, really helpful for us in terms of our reporting, and making sure that our webinars are fit for purpose and that we're improving them every time as well. And Andy's just posted in the chat as well around our future webinars. So this is a whole summer series of Rhetoric to Reality webinars. And this kind of topic feeds into one of for example, the Power to the People webinar as well, which is about democratic processes. There's lots of overlap between our webinars as well. So hopefully we'll see you at another one as well. But has anybody got any final points or any questions? I mean, you've got a couple more minutes if you want to. Again, myself and Andy, as a policy team, are here to answer any questions at any point as well around this topic, or indeed anything else. So just please do drop us an email or give us a call. We're always here to help. That's our job. And just to thank our speakers, I think just the different perspectives is really, really interesting actually, because everyone come at this topic from a very different perspective. And thanks to our questions as well from our attendees. So really, really appreciate that. And again, it's part of a wider conversation, as I mentioned. It's not just, this isn't the end of it kind of thing. So it's something we're constantly dealing with on a daily basis, is policy implementation, etc. So yep, final thank you to everybody and have a great day.